Welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show, where we comment, analyse and discuss what we consider to be the issues of the day. The Daily Friend Show is brought to you by the Institute of Race Relations and the Big Liberty Show. I have in the studio with me, Nicholas and Gabriel.
Morning. How's this?
And we are going to talk about the gift that keeps giving, and that is the Public Protector. She's just had another matter declared unconstitutional and invalid, and the High Court have essentially voided her report on the Estina Dairy project. Sorry. Just to give a bit of background, the project ostensibly involved Ace Magashule, who was then Premier of the Free State, and Musebenzi Zwane, who was then the MEC of Agriculture. And 200 million rand allocated to developing farmers, particularly dairy farmers, went to the Guptas, 30 million of which went to the infamous Gupta wedding. Now, this not being the first time she's done it, how does she manage to survive? Doesn't know her job? Is she favouring people? Is she doing a political favour to somebody?
Well, I think what happened here was after Thuli Madonsela caused such problems for Zuma, her replacement had to be someone who would definitely not make the same kind of trouble. And so it seems as though the government found someone who was far more party loyalty ranked probably first amongst their virtues. In this case, it's actually interesting that this is one of the great failures of the EFF, because the EFF actually, when it came to vote on her appointment, ignored the warning signs and declared that opposition to her was basically a racist DA plot to prevent a black woman becoming the public protector again, which is which has turned out to be not a very good line of attack, because now they look a bit like they didn't know what they were talking about. They chose racial solidarity over her competence and very obvious party loyalty.
One thing that strikes me, she's been accused at best of being incompetent, just not knowing the law and not knowing how to apply it, and at worst of currying favour or doing political favours for top people. She is, although she's an advocate of the Supreme Court, or now the High Court, she's a career public servant. So she may not, in fact, have enough legal experience. And in a way, that would be worse, to allow yourself to go into a position where you're really only going to embarrass yourself.
Yeah, my reading of her is that she seems, at least from the outside, to have been a fairly successful schmoozer, someone who sort of gets along well with people who are powerful, is inoffensive to them, does not seem dangerous, doesn't seem like a wrecking ball. And I think that if we abstract for a moment to the obvious problem here, which is, how can you expect an executive branch to appoint a public protector that's going to protect the public rather than the executive branch, protect the executive branch from the public? I think that our constitutional founders would have envisaged a competitive democracy within which, if hypothetically a president was to appoint a public protector that was either incompetent or actively sort of subverting the process, then the electorate would see that, the case would be brought forward by the media, who's the ultimate public protector, and people would be persuaded by the facts on the ground, and they would vote differently come next time. But we've just had our election, and it hasn't worked out that way, and I think part of the reason it hasn't worked out that way, as Nicholas mentioned, is a sort of narrative about racial solidarity. Another part of the narrative, a sort of quite distinct strand, is the thought that what we have now in the ANC's new leadership is a team that is really committed to genuine reform, that's really committed to firing basically half of the ANC. And I think for people who buy into that narrative, the ruling that we're discussing now that basically voids her report should be extremely concerning. And I think that Ramaphosa's allies should be sort of raising the metaphorical pitchforks to say, if she is not dismissed on this basis and replaced with a credible alternative, then we know that we've been duped.
Her first real embarrassment was the ABSA case over whether it had to pay back the money for the bailout of Bancor. Without going into the details of the case, part of what came across was she was not only declared to have committed an act that was invalid and unconstitutional, but she'd actually drafted an amendment to the Constitution which was completely out of her remit. And it involved her being required to pay a portion of the costs personally. In consequence of that, the DA twice referred her appointment to the Portfolio Committee on Justice. And yet here we still sit. And surely it is just too important to allow this to happen again. And it wasn't just confined to two instances.
Yeah, I feel like that old phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, it's shame on us.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another gift that keeps giving. Helen Zille tweeting. I'm going to go in reverse order. Gabriel, you have strong feelings?
I do have strong views about privilege. And part of this has to do with the fact that I was sort of philosophically trained, and one of the things that philosophers like to do when they see there's a problem, when there's like an irreconcilable problem, people keep disagreeing and keep knocking heads, is to wonder whether it's because there's just a failure to communicate, whether the terms aren't being properly understood. So I think that a useful thing, without going into too much detail, a useful thing to do with the term privilege is to break it down in two separate ways. The one way is to say privilege in terms of what? It's a social construct, so the things it's going to be cashed out in are socially constructed entities that fall out of our basic desires. The basic desires are for property, power, and prestige, or the positive regard of others. So are you talking about power privilege or property privilege or esteem privilege? The second way to break it down is to notice how those desires get manifested. How do we go after property or power or prestige? Well, we generally do it like everything we do in rooms. And so you'll find in some rooms, I'm pretty sure, there is white privilege in the sense that if you go into that room, you'll get more positive esteem because there are a bunch of white racists there who see another white person and think, oh, that's fantastic. Likewise, there's some rooms, bars, bedrooms, shebeens, whatever. You go in there, and if you're black, you're going to get more positive regard than you would otherwise get. So in that sense, at least in the regard sense, there's clearly white privilege and there's clearly black privilege in separate rooms. In the power sense, which I think is very important, because the rooms of power, the centers of power, kind of dictate a certain fundamental quality about all of the other rooms. It's the bedrock on which all of the other rooms are construed. Things are very disturbing. The presidency, the cabinet, Luthuli House, which kind of determines the presidency and the cabinet, the National Executive Council of the ANC, the courts, the police, the army headquarters. In all of those centers of power, those actual rooms of power, I think it's pretty clear just by looking at the appointments that there's not much in the way of extra positive regard going to white people. And I think in some of those rooms, there very clearly is extra positive regard going for black people and against white people, Luthuli House being the most obvious. And I recently saw, a comparison of Mandela's cabinet versus Ramaphosa's proposed cabinet and Zuma's cabinets. The ANC is becoming increasingly less diverse. So those centers of power, there seems to be prima facie a lot of black privilege. Constitutional Court last year, John Cain Berman, one of our esteemed colleagues, delivered a report about some of its more disturbing rulings. The one that really stood out to me was that they ruled it can be better to hire no one than to hire a white person. So that's a nice way of saying that in some rooms, white people are not welcome. Property is the aspect that people most want to look at when they're talking up white privilege, because they might say, look, there was apartheid, and then the corridors of power, the centers of power were privileging white people. Now you have to have the centers of power privileging black people, because the knock-on effect of the power was property, a property distribution that advantaged white people. So I think that's an important thing to look at. I think there's two basic myths that I want to quickly debunk, and then I'll wrap it up. One of them, start with a bit of a fact. As far as we can tell, there are more black dollar millionaires than white dollar millionaires. It's an important class because people that are that wealthy are able to guarantee their children's future, more or less. A lot of people, I've said this on radio, I've written about it, the pushback that I get is, No, but it's not demographically representative because there's a lot more black people than there are white people. So if there are only slightly more black dollar millionaires than white dollar millionaires, things aren't good enough. We need to keep growing the dollar millionaires. I think that this is a little bit misconstrued. The one way that it's misconstrued is it speaks to this myth that if there are people the same color as you and they're rich, then you're going to be rich too. Musi Maimani spoke to this. He said, you know, me and my wife might have seemed to come from similar circumstances, but because she was a white person, she could start a business and have a whole bunch of white investors get involved there because they have the same color skin. Now, that's just not the case. You go to Bears Valley, close to where I live, and you see white poor kids walking around. They can't go to school. They hardly wear clothes. They're begging for food. There's white squatter camps. Those guys are not getting investment. They're not getting advantages in the rooms that they're in because of the color of their skin being shared by other rich people. But it's even more obvious for poor black people. There are tens of millions of poor black people who are getting less than nothing out of the fact that there are rich black dollar millionaires. They're not even getting title deeds. Those rich black people who are connected to the levers of power, to the centers of power, could very simply say, look, here's a difference between the room we live in and the room that most poor black people live in. Our rooms are backed by the state. We have private title deeds to these rooms so we can turn these rooms into living capital. We can raise loans against it to start businesses and do what we want. Those guys can't do it. They can't even sell their homes because it's state-owned property. If rich black people really were using their power and their wealth to enhance poor black people, we wouldn't be sitting 25 years after 1994 with a situation where 20 million poor black people are living as vassals for the state on state-owned land.
Nick, I very much doubt that those in political power will have defined the subject of white privilege or the issue of white privilege as clearly and decisively as Gabriel has done. Is it really an issue that has been sort of philosophically fleshed out, or is it race baiting?
Well, in some corridors, it has been a little bit more fleshed out, but I think Gabriel just gave a very good deconstruction of why it tends to rely on kind of generalizations. And in Helen Zille's original tweet, what she was actually trying to do, if you sort of read those threads, was disparage racial generalizations generally. So she was saying by using the hashtag Black Privilege, she was creating a completely unfair generalization about an entire group of people. And that was her point. She said that afterwards. She said, no. So it's not, why is it acceptable in such a case, but not acceptable in another case? Which is quite a simple point, actually. But because of the way that media works, it was almost completely lost in the debate afterwards. I think, white privilege is one of those sort of, it's a term that does an awful lot of work in our debate. It has all these kind of built-in myths and assumptions, and it's used to carry a lot of weight and as a kind of a rhetorical cudgel to batten down people. But when you begin to, as Gabriel has just done very well, pick apart the specifics of it, it doesn't stand up to as much scrutiny as it would otherwise.
And the impression gained is that the use of it or the abuse of it or the reliance on it isn't actually what's going to make a difference to achieve the aims of uplifting millions of black people from poverty.
It has been extremely useful though for black and white and Indian and colored elites to hold on to their power. I often come back to the story of Jacques Poe's book, The President's Keepers, because it was the most successful book, non-fiction political book in the last decade, or in the Zuma era, let's say. And the point that he draws out is that the President's Keepers, the first row of the President's Keepers, as he calls them, were people who said, look, what we're doing here is we're defending authentic blackness against white monopoly capital. And it starts all the way back in 2004 with saying that Bulelani Ngcuka is an impimpi because he's going after Shabir Sheikh and Mo Sheikh and Zuma. And it plays out in rooms, in SARS, with real people. Johan van Loggerent, for example, gets maligned partly on the basis of race. This story of white privilege reaching out its tentacles and going after people like Zuma and his children and his allies because they're black was very effectively used by Zuma and his allies in order to rob us as South Africans, all of us, blind. And again, I want to say, so it happened. First time, okay, shame on them because this country has a horrible history and they took this almost inevitable quality to emerge out of that history, which is a readiness to say, look, if you're criticizing a black person, it could be because you're racist. They took that quality, they used it for nefarious ends. Shame on them. But if we allow it to happen again, then shame on us, because we can do better. We can look case by case, room by room, person by person, rather than sort of allow the vague generalizations to be weaponized against all of us. And of course, those who get hurt most are the most vulnerable.
Finally, just to wrap up with a little speculation, David Mabuza, he hasn't yet taken up or agreed to take up or signed that he will take up his parliamentary position. I've heard one rumor that it's illness. Nicholas, I think you've heard.
So I read that the speculation was that he was going to go before the ANC's Internal Integrity Commission and give them a briefing or a defense of himself as to why he should not be considered possibly
Lacking
problematic. Lacking in integrity, exactly. What this could be is a sort of a kind of show trial way of absolving him of guilt. So it's possible that he could go before the committee and say, here's why I'm not guilty, and then the committee will say, oh, yes, of course. That's exactly, we agree completely. You're not guilty of anything. Or it could be a sign of something else more complicated going on inside the ANC. Maybe this is Cyril's move against him, although I think he would be fighting it harder if he felt like he was threatened, and he doesn't seem to be fighting it.
I'm old enough to remember that there was a lot of reportage on Mabuza. It was more than speculation, but it wasn't necessarily proven fact that he'd been involved in some really heinous criminal activity in the lead up to, during, and probably after the Soccer World Cup. Surely that sort of thing has got to start to resurface at this point.
Yeah, I imagine so. It is hard to see how this plays out, though, because because one of the narratives is that we've got this very strong reformist lobby within the ANC, and I think, as Nicholas is pointing out, one way that you can tell that reform lobby is really strong is when people start going to jail, which is beyond the horizon that I can see. And so before that, the nearer horizon would be when you see serious resistance. And the resistance so far, at least from Mabuza's side, seems to be pretty tepid. He doesn't seem to be trying very hard to get ahead of the story. I imagine that his PR advisors would say, okay, let's go back to the World Cup thing and let's start putting some spin out on this, because we can anticipate that we're going to get it's going to come out. I'm not seeing that. So in South Africa, we often sort of have these situations where it's like, okay, we could have a big win, great reform, or we could have a terrible loss, like the wicked guys managed to hold on to the reins of power even more strongly. And then you end up with this draw where nothing really happens. There's a lot of talk about it. And then sort of, 12 years later, you still have Jacob Zuma fighting in court.
I wondered whether your proposal of really being seen to fight against the change is something we're seeing in Ace Magashule, because
he is leading.
There's no doubt the IMF, the World Investment Community, has virtually demanded that South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC, implement economic reforms that favour free market capitalism, etc. Whereas Ace Magashule comes out very, very strong as a result of the meeting earlier this week or last week with the ANC, affirming that the NDR and all its various facets are being pushed ahead boldly. Or I'm just being wishful thinking.
I just think that, so it might be the case that there's a genuine, the ANC's always had tensions. It might be the case that the sort of degree to which Magashule is talking left and Ramaphosa had been talking sort of slightly more centrist in the build-up to the election is a useful kind of good cop, bad cop kind of game, where it doesn't mean you're going to see a split one way or the other, but it's sort of a bit of a rhetorical technique. On the other hand, maybe it does.
Something else.
Yeah.
Perhaps Ace is simply building his credentials and profile for either a challenge to Ramaphosa or to replace him eventually one day.
So, in other words, anything is possible, and we will have to wait and see. Thank you once again for joining us. Please do support the Daily Friend and the IRR. In order to do so, if you simply SMS to 32823, somebody will be in contact with you with a view of trying to sign you up for a monthly donation of 70 to 90 Rand odd. Otherwise, you can catch the Daily Friend on http://dailyfriend.co.za. Thank you. Until next time.